And I realize I have this background that I can have on my screen of the Israeli flag, and I don't need a green screen behind me to be able to show it clearly. So while uh, Israel's war is proceeding, I will uh, keep this background as my background. Um, I've said a lot the past couple of weeks about Hamas, about the barbarity of Hamas and its charter to want to destroy the state of Israel. I've talked about the anti-Semitism. I've talked about world opinion about Israel. I I want to spend some time today to talk about the morality of going to war in general, and the morality, the issues facing morality as Israel fights Hamas. All right, so bear with me as I go through this. So what the asking the question whether war is moral, it might seem to be an absurd question, because on the face of it, war is immoral. So how can going to war be moral? Right? So the idea is, on the one hand, when we think about going to war, we think about two things. Either that a country goes to war against another country in order to acquire territory. So if you think about war in the ancient world or war in medieval world, that's essentially the main reason why countries or empires went to war. They wanted to acquire territory. Or, on the other hand, war could be defensive in nature. In other words, a country attacks and another country, and that other country responds by going to war. Okay, so you think about Japan attacking Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. President Roosevelt immediately declared war on Japan, right? So that declaration of war seems then to be an example of one of the reasons why we go to war. Whereas another reason could be Hitler's reason for going to war, to want to take over Europe, right? So war then, for those two things, whether it's to acquire territory or whether it is to fight back, might have a question, might raise ethical and moral questions for a country, especially a country whose constitution defines what the country is all about, right? So democratic countries, essentially Western countries, all have a constitution on which they are based and which serve as the foundation of why that country exists, and would have within the constitution an idea of what it stands for and therefore what it should fight for, right? So you think back to the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. So there, the Continental Congress essentially lays out the basis for why the United States should come into being, and why, what is the basis for fighting the tyrannical British Empire, right? So in defense, so if a reason for going to war is defense, or if a reason for a country to be established is as a means of revolting against the tyrannical empire, then perhaps there are moral issues at stake, right? And that is protecting the citizens of the country, right? If in December 7th, 1941, America was threatened by Japan. And so in order to protect the United States Army and Navy, all its armed forces, and potential further attacks from Japan on mainland America, war is declared in order to protect the lives of the citizens. September 11th, 2001, when airplanes were flown into the World Trade Center towers in New York and in the Pentagon here in DC, Virginia, war is declared, but not, see here an extra layer of complexity comes to bear, because it's not a country that America declared war on September 11th, 2001, but rather a war on terrorism. So to find Osama bin Laden, who was the architect and the funder of the terrorists who flew the planes that day, killing over 3,000 Americans, right? So you have a moral issue. Moral issues are at stake for World War II and how America got involved in World War II, and the war on terrorism as a result of being attacked on September 11th, 2001. Just giving those two examples just to show the nuance at play for what the morality would be. So, right, so war in and of itself might be immoral, but if it's a defensive reason for going to war, then there are moral issues at stake, namely protecting the country and protecting the citizens of the country. But then more moral and ethical issues come into play to guide how that war then is conducted, right? So there's the first question, whether going to war, the reason for going to war, is a morally and ethically justified reason. And then how that war is waged also is based on moral and ethical principles. Okay, so I want to step back from that now, understanding what the context is for what I wanted to talk about today, to say what is the Jewish view of war, right? A war of conquest for territory, a war of defensive nature, and what are the Jewish perspectives of that, and what are the issues that come to play, that are coming to play, as Israel wages its war against Hamas in Gaza. So there are a couple of things about this. So and this is not necessarily something that I am proud of, but the Torah teaches quite clearly to Moses and the Israelites in Sinai, at Mount Sinai, and then over the course of the 40 years getting to the land of Israel, according to the Torah, God commands Moses and the people of Israel that when they enter the land of Israel, which God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah, as the eternal homeland of their descendants, that is the Israelite people, that is the Jewish people, as the people of Israel enter the land of Israel, they are supposed to wage war against the indigenous inhabitants of the land of Israel, war to such a degree that they will wipe out and annihilate the indigenous population of the land of Israel. Okay, so that war is called a milchemet chova, an obligatory war. That is, it was commanded by God to the people of Israel to wage war, to wage that war of conquest and settlement. It is a religious war, a war in which the book of Joshua, the book that comes chronologically right after the Torah, the book of Joshua comes to teach how the people of Israel fulfilled that commandment. And it did not completely fulfill the commandment, but tried to fulfill that commandment. The book of Judges and the books of Samuel have as part of the underpinning of the book the attempt at the fulfillment of that command that's in the Torah. All right. So what I said before, that I'm not proud of, that is the extremely theologically problematic sense that is a commandment in the Torah, right? A commandment in the Torah to settle the land of Israel, and in the process of settling it, to annihilate the indigenous, I should say, idolatrous population. All right, so the theological problem is God wrote the Torah. So if you accept that premise that God wrote the Torah, then you're accepting a premise that God is commanding this question. Well, it's not a question, but it's a question for us as to whether this is morally acceptable. But because God wrote the Torah, and we accept the idea that God gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai, and as a Jew descended from that experience on Mount Sinai, we accept then, if we buy into this traditional perspective, we're accepting that traditional idea that the indigenous idolatrous Canaanite population deserves to die. So if we don't buy into the idea that God gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai, then we have another problem. So the first problem is buying into this what seems to be a morally repugnant command to annihilate an indigenous population just because they are idolatrous. If we don't buy into the fact that God gave the traditional idea, not the fact, the traditional idea that God gave the Torah to Mount Sinai, if we don't buy into that, then we have another problem. If the Torah still serves as the basis for who we are as a Jewish people and what our moral and ethical values are, then how do we come to grips with this terrible command to annihilate the indigenous population? Do we ignore it and just say, well, in its historical context, 3,000 years ago, this is how we understand the Torah and the rest of the Bible? Don't understand it as God commanding this. Understand it instead as a segment of the Israelite society at the time in wanting to take control over the land of Israel, and see as its basis for doing that the oral tradition that the land was promised to the people of Israel, and to Abraham and Sarah and their descendants. All right, so you can come to grips with it morally by saying, oh, God didn't write the Torah, so don't think that God is a morally repugnant God, but rather this is people's understanding of what they think God wants us to do, which is a major problem, right? Because those terrorists who flew the airplanes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon thought God was telling them to do that, right? So it's a problem, a major moral, ethical, theological, religious problem to say that you're doing something because God told you to do it, or because you think God told you to do it, or that you think you're fulfilling an ancient command from God to do it. Anything that uses God as the source for doing something so, on the face of it, evil, is a problem. So that kind of war of entering the land of Israel, from the Torah, and as the other books of the Bible portray it, seems to be a morally, theologically, religiously religious problem that we've had to deal with, which is why there's a certain segment of the Jewish community today, a certain segment of the conservative movement today, that suggests that those references to war that we find in the prayer book should be omitted. So there are notes in the red Sidur Lev Shalem that we use on Shabbat. There are notes there and sections that are bracketed as well, that the editor, the editorial committee suggests some people omit this. So, for example, in the preliminary service of Shabbat and every day, we remember the Song of the Sea, which highlights God's saving power and killing the Egyptian army that was chasing after the Israelites. So if we say that battle in the name of God is bad, then we might not want to reference that, and therefore we might not want to focus on that. All right, so this is one area of war that we have to understand Jewishly, that there's a theological component in ancient Judaism and in our ancient history to the initial wars that were waged in settling the land of Israel. Okay, and to further point out the theocratic nature of waging this war, that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would be involved in that process, and the Urim and Tumim, these two oracle stones, would be used in the process of waging these wars too. Okay, so there's that one issue. So I'm not claiming now that the war against Hamas is one of these wars. But I am just saying that there is that element of Jewish tradition that will claim that we have to keep in mind that there are certain kind of wars that go all the way back in our tradition that were not only acceptable, but they are commanded to be waged. Okay? The other element of this of war, as we're looking at how Israel is fighting Hamas, gets to the other moral and ethical issues involved when the state of Israel, as a state among the global nations, and subscribes to particular global United Nations treaties on how to wage war, treatment of prisoners of war, etc., how Israel um, wages this war against Hamas according to international laws and according to Jewish law as well. All right, so there is um, there is this idea. I was just looking at a couple of notes, and just that's why I was hesitating. So there's this verse in the Torah which tells us, in the section in which it says, one of the sections that says, when you enter the land of Israel, you're supposed to conduct this war of annihilation. When you lay siege to cities in the process of conducting this war, and you need to cut down trees for wood for in the process of fighting, you cannot cut down fruit trees. You can only cut down non-fruit bearing trees in the conduct of this war. Okay? So that means that there's no reason given for that in the Torah. It just says you should not cut down these fruit-bearing trees. So commentaries over the ages have tried to explain that as to why that would be a case. In other words, if you're waging war, shouldn't all material equipment available be used in this process? And the Torah is saying no. You have to keep in mind that the war will be over and people need to go on living after the war, and you can't deny survivors of the war an opportunity to eat. So cutting down a fruit tree might mean that for short term you might need the wood of that tree for your war, but you're going to need the fruit of that tree later in order to eat and survive. So no, you cannot cut down the fruit bearing tree. So this verse is used to teach lots of things about how Israel should conduct its war, always keeping in mind the non-combatants, the civilians, and the effect then that war will have on the civilians, right? So there's a lot of question. Well, this gets to what I've talked to in the 2 prior weeks, just about the West's perspective on Israel and how Israel is never treated almost never treated sympathetically in the mainstream media, and as a result, how that negative treatment is then leads to, as we're seeing now, unbelievable acts of protest and anti-Semitism. Just 2 examples of that as I get back to this topic of war. Just in case we're not aware of this, on the Times of Israel, have not seen this on the New York Times yet, but a Russian Airlines flight called Red Wings, I think, or maybe it's just called Wings Airlines, something like that. It's a Russian-based airline. Had a flight yesterday from Tel Aviv to an area of Russia known as Dagestan. And apparently Dagestan, which I've never heard of, and I pride myself on being pretty familiar with geography, this is an area that is next to Azerbaijan. Now, I've heard of Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is next to Armenia. Okay, so if you can picture the map of the Middle East in your head, go due north from Israel. Due north from Israel will get you to Lebanon, will then get you to Syria, will then get you to Turkey, will then get you to Armenia and Azerbaijan. So to the east of Azerbaijan is Dagestan. And there used to be some Jews there. And apparently this flight had Israelis on it, and also some Dagestani children who had been brought to Israel for medical treatment. There are people around the Middle East who know that Israel is the premier place for medical services. And if they can afford it, people in neighboring countries go to Israel for medical treatment. Okay? Even Hamas children have been brought into Israel over the past decades to be treated in Israeli hospitals. Okay? So this flight was greeted at the airport in Dagestan by a mob of pro-Palestinian protesters who demanded all Israelis to be brought off the plane because they wanted to violently attack them. Fortunately, the Russian army finally took over, or the police, whatever it was. Just look at Times of Israel. And even on the Times of Israel now, you have to scroll down a bit till you find the article talking about it. Finally, the police took over and arrested most of the people in that mob. And Israel then protested to the Russian ambassador to Israel and to the foreign ministry of Russia about this egregious protest. That's number one. And number two was that among all the college campuses in which anti-Semitism is running rampant, Cornell University yesterday responded and to an increased threat of anti-Semitism. Like, it's gotten to the level where the Cornell authorities are thinking that Jewish students are at risk. They were suggesting to the strongly urging Jewish students at Cornell not to enter the kosher dining hall on campus for fear that they might be attacked. So those two examples of many that we're reading about, if you're looking at the right sources to read about them, because the New York Times had something about Cornell yesterday, and but it didn't have anything about Dagestan. So I'm bringing those two examples up of as a reaction to, or for the protesters, that they are legitimate acts of protest because of Israel's overwhelming retaliation for what happened on October 7th. So in other words, 1,400 Israelis are killed, 8,000 Palestinians, residents of Gaza, supposedly, if you believe the Gaza Health Ministry, have been killed by Israel. That is disproportionate. And whatever happens to Israel now, they have it coming to them, that they are being immoral in how they are conducting this war. Okay, so the idea is that Israel, in conducting its war with Hamas, understands completely the verse from the Torah about not cutting down the fruit tree. In other words, Israel understands completely that in its process of protecting its citizens, as any country in the world has the right to do, they need to get to the source of the evil and eradicate it without too much, if any, collateral damage, without killing innocent civilians in the process. So, of course, we know that Israel's major challenge is, just like America's challenge in 2001 is, when you're fighting terrorists, you don't have one known base of operations that you're fighting, and it's not an entity like a country like America fighting Japan as a result of December 7th, 1941, right? Attacking Japan, you know where their naval bases are, you know where their army bases are. That's where you go to retaliate first. Fighting Nazis in Europe, you know the military targets to go to first in Europe when you land on the beaches of Normandy. All right, so you have a plan, you know where to go, right? That is how countries fight each other: army against army, navy against navy. Civilians are often caught in the crosshairs, and there are refugees as a result, but the civilians are not the target. So in fighting Hamas, in fighting a terrorist organization, again, that New York Times still has not adequately reported. They'd said something, I think there was something in the New York Times yesterday. Israel claims that a hospital in Gaza is a base of Hamas operations. The headline was something like that on the New York Times website, as opposed to the Times of Israel website on Friday, which said what the spokesperson for Israel's army said, that the Shifa hospital, the main hospital in Gaza, the basement of that hospital is the command center for Hamas. There are actually several command centers in the basement, and many of the tunnels originate from that basement of that the hospital, the basement of that hospital, right? So now, so whether the West reports on this or not, it highlights the major strategic challenge that Israel faces, namely how to get to Hamas without destroying the hospital, how to get to the hostages who are most likely in those tunnels without killing the hostages, right? Because the Hamas terrorists are in the tunnels. You need to kill the terrorists. If they stay in the tunnels and the tunnels are bombarded and collapse, then inevitably the hostages die too. And in the process of those tunnels collapsing, innocent civilians who are being treated in the hospital or who live in apartment buildings that are above the tunnels, they're going to collapse and civilians die. So Israel has to weigh the political consequence of this war, along with the civilian consequence of this war, and has to weigh loss of life versus protection of Israel's citizens versus eradicating the evil of Hamas versus soldiers who will inevitably, Israeli soldiers who will inevitably die in the course of this battle with Hamas. So there's a lot of life that Israel has to consider. in the process of waging this retaliatory, self-defensive, morally acceptable war. So the 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 main thing Israel is dealing with, well, fortunately, America, or President Biden and the administration, so far has said, because I saw this yesterday, either on Times of Israel and also on New York Times, that President Biden and the administration has said that the way that Israel is conducting the war so far, including the limited ground incursions into Gaza, is perfectly acceptable. Right? So they have come out publicly to still support Israel. Okay? What seems to be a lone voice. Perhaps European countries are, even though they're quiet, might be in agreement with President Biden and the US administration, that so at least Israel knows that so far in how they're conducting this war, America still has Israel's back. But there's a lot of pressure, a lot of political pressure at play because of the misinformation that has been out there and has continued to be out there and continues to be expressed as if it is truth. The misinformation then leads to a misperception of who Israel is and what it stands for, right? That Israel is misperceived as a colonial oppressor, and that what its retaliation is excessive, and that leads to the not only the pro-Palestinian support out there, but also leads to anti-Semitism. That many of the pro-Palestinian rallies have people attending holding up signs, "Death to the Jews." Right, so there's that, and then there's also political leaders in the West are affected by this misinformation and also want to influence Israel because of that. So there's the morality in how Israel's waging the war, and then there's also the morality of seeking truth and how we go about seeking truth in order to conduct this war and to support Israel as morally and ethically as possible. So these are the what I wanted to talk about today. Any questions or comments about this?
Yeah,
So
when you started, I thought you were going to do something different.
go
Okay.
ahead.
When you talked about wars are fought over land, well,
Yeah.
this is as far as I'm concerned, I don't know as much history as you. Wars are either fought over land or revenge. And I think this war is both. Even if for some reason the Hamas and all the Arab nations were able to throw Israel out, they would still be after the Jews. I don't think they'd be satisfied with that. And so that's a reason why you have to eliminate them.
Okay, so it's an interesting point there too. So it's the matter of Israel's survival, which is at stake here in this war. So there's an existential threat to Israel in this war. The fact that Israel was caught so off guard on October 7th, that so off guard that 1,400 Israelis were killed just like that. Uh, Really, there's no excuse for that, uh, how that could have happened. So there will be a reckoning in Israel when this war is over. But so the state of Israel's survival is at stake, but also at the same time, as you're rightly pointing out, Saul, is that Jewish survival is at stake. So, so the Jewish community and the global Jewish community and the state of Israel are intertwined because they are the same thing, right? The state of Israel is the land of Israel, is our eternal homeland. So this is why the Israeli flag is my background. Even though born and raised in America, third generation American, still Israel is part of my soul and it's part of every Jew's soul. Yes, and when Hamas has in its charter the destruction of the state of Israel, it is therefore, because the state of Israel is Jewish, it is an anti-Semitic statement, not just an anti-Israel statement. Would Hamas then be chasing down Jews around the world? It's possible. It's possible that they would do that. We don't know for sure, but yes, that any threat to the state of Israel is a threat to Jews around the world, because any battle waged against Israel is really a battle waged against the Jewish community, as we see it being played out right now, right? And the truth, the hatred has bubbled to the surface so quickly that might have been below the surface and was just simmering and was being able to be handled and controlled for the past couple of decades. Somehow, what Hamas did on October 7th allowed this hatred to boil up and over this pot, so that people have been so willing to take advantage of it and express their rabid anti-Semitism. So yes, so the way that Israel is fighting this war, there is that. So countries have a right to wage war in their constitution because of a threat to the country's existence. So a threat to Israel's existence, though, is compounded by also a threat then to the global Jewish community. So that when Israel fights in self-defense, it is in defense of also the Jewish community around the world. So yeah, so there's that moral and ethical imperative about this too.
Another thing that bothers me when I read all the stories in the newspaper or online is they talk about that how the Hamas killed 1,400 Jews, but they actually murdered them.
Right.
And you always point that out.
Yes.
That
Right.
difference in the Torah, and that we're allowed to kill if we're defending ourselves, but you're not allowed to murder.
Right. So so Saul, you're absolutely right. It plays into the West's narrative that Hamas is fighting a legitimate war, and that they are first the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people, which is false, and two, that it was what they did on October 7th was totally appropriate. So, which is also morally repugnant. So yes, the way the West continues to refer to Hamas as fighters, combatants, militants, and the Western media refuses to call them terrorists. Because if they call them terrorists, then that means what they did was wrong, and that what Israel is doing is right and legitimate. So Western media has refused to call them terrorists, and therefore looks the other way when with what happened on October 7th. Why there is something on the New York Times today, some video montage of interviews. It's a 4.5 minute thing. If you subscribe to the New York Times, you'll be able to see it. I'm not sure you can see it for free. I don't know because I subscribe to the New York Times. It's a 4-minute video of Israelis who had to flee from the towns outside of Gaza because of the massacre on October 7th, and they're in hotels. And so they're like 4 or 5 people interviewed just about what it means. These are people who had empathy for the plight of innocent Palestinians who no longer have empathy. So I'm not sure what the purpose of this is. Perhaps it's, as a Jew and a supporter of Israel, this is something that Israelis are reckoning with. The loss of what Hamas did and forced Israel to do is to hate people and perhaps to want to be vengeful. And so hating Hamas for doing that too. But that doesn't exactly come across in this video. Anyway, the whole idea about this is this this sense of revenge and this sense of that what it's how it's tearing Israel apart. That the sense that the West refuses to call them terrorists, then also puts Israel in an untenable situation. So that so the West continues to forget about the butchery of October 7th and continues to ignore whatever Israel is trying to do in terms of explaining how moral Israel is attempting to be and how Hamas continues to be immoral by using its own fellow Palestinians as human shields. Yeah, so there are a number of immoral elements to this war. Jules, and then Barbara. So you have to unmute yourself, Jules. Judy, unmute. Yeah, you're muted, Jules. So let's let Judy figure that out, and let's go to Barbara.
What I find very disturbing is the fact that UNESCO keeps on talking about being humanitarian action, and yet I don't hear them say, Hamas, if you be humanitarian and give up the hostages. You don't hear that at all.
Right. So there's right. So that's as I mentioned earlier, and the conduct of war, the international treaties about how countries conduct war, there's an aspect of what to do with prisoners of war. So these are hostages, and they're not prisoners of war. And yes, the United Nations, which is supposed to be neutral, which is supposed to promote morality and ensure that countries abide by international treaties, refuse to support Israel in this process. And as I spoke about on Shabbat, it's mind-boggling to me how the United Nations would pass overwhelmingly a resolution criticizing Israel for its killing of innocent Palestinian civilians and totally not mentioning and ignoring the Hamas butchery of October 7th. So by doing that, the United Nations then clearly states that it's not neutral, that it is biased, and that it is not, that Israel can't feel protected and a full-fledged member of the United Nations because of the overwhelming bias that has been there against Israel from the very beginning. Jules, you haven't figured it out yet. You're still muted. You can, if you can see a space bar on the keypad in front of you, all you have to do, Jules, is hold down the space bar and keep it pressed, and you'll be unmuted. You did it. Go ahead and talk.
I don't know whether you were aware today that Israel has, with respect to Hezbollah, has moved 20,000 people out of a city close to the border,
Right.
and that Hezbollah has rocketed the empty city.
Yes.
Nobody was hurt because Israel had moved all the people out.
Right.
But it points out, it brings to mind that none of this is important to the world.
Right.
But the way you describe it is, the way you say it.
Yeah. No,
It's-
absolutely. And so I know that I'm preaching to the choir here of people who support Israel, and I'm hoping that the people who watch the recording of this, I assume most of them, if not all of them, are also strong supporters of Israel. So yes, what Hezbollah is doing in the north is also, well, it's referenced in the New York Times, so we know that that New York Times is reporting about how Israel has struck back at some Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, and how Israel has struck the airports in Syria, Damascus and Aleppo, that serve as transit points for the weapons that Hezbollah receives and also Hamas receives from Iran. So, and the United States recently was involved in attacking some of these military targets in Syria as well. So yeah, Israel is being prudent because in fighting back against Hezbollah, because understanding not wanting to be stretched too thin. They're focused, and I'm not a military strategist, but this is obvious that their focus rightly is on Hamas and on getting the 220 hostages freed. And if they engage with Hezbollah, then precious resources will be diverted to the border with Lebanon. And so Israel is showing a modicum of restraint so that they can be as focused as possible on Hamas. Saul, did you want to ask another question?
Just another thought that I had, and maybe you could spend a whole hour on it, but before the war, whatever I read anything from the Israeli press, they were always talking about, Americans don't have to tell us what to do. They don't vote here, they don't pay taxes here, and we'll discount what they're saying. But I think that just, between the US and maybe Great Britain, we're the only ones that are really supporting what Israel is doing. And how is that going to change politics in the future, knowing that, the US has their back? And how are they going to discount Americans' opinion?
Right. So I'll address this, Saul, from the topic for today, in that it has been clear since the United States, just a few minutes after Israel declared itself a state on May 15th, 1948, the U.S. was the first one to officially acknowledge that, yes, Israel is a state. since the very beginning, the United States has been a strong supporter of Israel, and I think that's because of the common moral and ethical ground on which we stand. So that Israel is the rightful home of the Jewish people, as whether you read the Torah literally or not, or that was given by God to us literally or not, the story we're reading in the Torah right now is about the root of our connection to the soil of the land of Israel. So we go back 3,500, 3,600 years. And if you don't believe in the Torah as historically true, then we know that we've been there since King David. So 3,000 years. We know that as archaeologically and historically true. So, yes, so we have a moral right to be there. We have a historic connection to the land. We are not colonizers of the land of Israel. We are just rightfully continuing to live there. And it just so happens that now we are an autonomous state of Israel. So yes, America and Israel are intertwined morally and ethically, and Israel, no matter what it can say as showing how great it is, knows that Israel can't exist without the strong support of the United States. And so they might say something to show how great we are and how independent we are, but everybody agrees, every prime minister has agreed, they cannot press too many buttons in America because they don't want to risk that relationship. So, all right, let's it's 11:57. Let's stop here for today. The conversation tragically will continue, I'm sure, next week as we continue to talk about Hamas and Jews and the news. So have a good rest of the day, everybody, and peace in Israel.
Thank you.